Hi everybody, and welcome to another video of the Simplified series. Now, before going on to the main topic of this video, I would like to draw your attention to something that came to my attention a couple of weeks ago. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I was actually contacted by a Swedish player called Jörgen Magnusson. Probably doesn't mean much to you, it didn't mean much to me when I read the name, but Jörgen is actually a Swedish FIDE master, and he is the current president of the IBCA, the International Federation for Visually Impaired Chess Players. He was a 4 times world junior champion for visually impaired, and he has also been the #1 rated player for seniors in this category. Now, the reason he contacted me is that because he obviously for visually impaired, he realized that there is a big problem when it comes to creating content and especially videos for visually impaired. So with the help of a friend, he actually managed to build a platform and started a YouTube channel where he produces content for visually impaired chess players. The reason he contacted me was that in fact he managed to use one of my ideas from my 1E4 Simplified Chessable course against the Caro-Kann. You will see the link to that video in the video description to this video of mine. To make it, well, he won a very nice game, which he analyzes in that video. But I think what makes this story even more incredible is that in May this year, Jörgen actually started undergoing chemotherapy for cancer. But this has not stopped him from continuing to create content for his fellow visually impaired chess players. So at the beginning of my video today, I'm just basically asking you to take a look at this video where he explains this victory in the Caro-Kann. Support if you can, subscribe if you can. Probably it would mean much, not only to me, but much more to Jörgen and big number of players who are visually impaired, but they still would like to enjoy our game. So like I said, you check the link in the content in the description of this video, follow through, take a look at the video, take a look at the game, subscribe, support in any way you can, because, well, if we don't support the courageous amongst us, well, who will? So now we can go back to the main topic of today's video, which is, as you can see from the name, quite an ambitious one. The idea for this video came to me when I was thinking about my first victory against the Grandmaster. And it came obviously very long time ago, and it featured the setup I'm going to recommend today. And this setup, the good thing about it is that it's equally or more or less equally applicable against 4 major open Sicilians. So it's the Najdorf, the Dragon, the Classical, and the Taimanov. So you can apply this 3rd rank setup against all these 4 mainstream Sicilians. But before we start, I think we should clarify what the 3rd rank setup is. Now, 3rd rank setup, I have probably read it somewhere in the 90s, but I've always referred it to 3rd rank setup for myself. And basically is the following setup for white. I will just give you a quick description, I would say, or visual cue what the 3rd rank setup is. If we take a look at the so-called Grivas Sicilian, that's a 5th Sicilian you can employ it against, and it arises after e4, c5, knight f3, let's say knight c6, d4, cd4, knight d4, queen b6. Now this is the Grivas Sicilian attacking the knight on d4, knight drops back to b3. So, as I said, 3rd rank setup. First piece on the 3rd rank, knight on b3, e6, knight c3, second piece on the 3rd setup, on the 3rd rank, a6, standard moves by black, bishop e3, developing with tempo, 3rd piece on the third rank, queen c7, f4, grabbing space in the center, threatening e5 at some point, d6, bishop d3, fourth piece on the third rank, knight f6, and queen f3, fifth piece on the third rank. Now it's probably more easily understandable why I called, or people call, this setup a third rank setup. As you can see, all white's pieces, bar the king and the rooks, are on the third rank. And the good thing about this setup is that it's a very universal one, and it can be applied against all these open Sicilians that I mentioned. This is also the Griva Sicilian, where you can also see it actually being employed without any obstruction by black. So this is the setup I am referring to, and we will see it in practice against all these different Sicilians. So now we can go back to the starting position, and as a kind of a starter, I would like to show you this first victory of mine against the Grandmaster. His name was Nino Kirov from Bulgaria, and how I managed to beat him using this setup. So that game featured the Taimanov Sicilian, so e6, d4, cd4, knight d4, knight c6, knight c3, and queen c7. The Taimanov Sicilian, a very popular choice nowadays. Bishop e3, a6, and now in that game I played the move a3, even though now I would recommend the move knight b3 in this video, just dropping the knight back to b3, even though not being forced to do so, in order to avoid different options for black, and then simply proceed with the third rank setup with f4, bishop d3, and so forth. We will take a look at this setup and at this particular move order via a bit later. So rest assured that we will analyze this. But to show you the potential of the setup, I'll just show you the game. a3. The idea of the move is to prevent bishop b4, knight f6, f4, threatening e5, d6, queen f3. Here comes the setup. Bishop's coming to d3. So bishop e7, bishop d3, castles, and now short castle. As you will see, white at some points will have the option to castle long in the third rank setup. While possible, in this video I will mostly concentrate on short castling, even though I will mention the possibilities where long castle is also a decent alternative. Obviously, castling long is a bit more dangerous and sharper, and sometimes it works pretty well, and I will point out these moments later on. In this game I castle short. Now black went for knight takes d4, a typical maneuver in the Sicilian, first eliminating the knight on d4, bishop takes d4, and now pushing e5. So by eliminating the knight on d4 first, black now stopped this knight f5, which would have been possible had the knight stayed on d4. So bishop drops back to e3, e takes f4, and now bishop takes f4. It's also possible to take with a queen. I won't go too much into detail. I'm just showing you this to see the potential. So bishop e6, king h1, getting away from possible checks. Knight d7, threatening knight d5, queen g3, knight e5. Black is objectively fine, and you will see that in all these lines black will be objectively fine most of the time, but as we know, it's impossible to gain advantage against any decent Sicilian nowadays. So our task will not be to obtain an advantage, but rather to obtain a playable position with a lot of pieces on board with chances of an attack. So now I play the move bishop h6, even though the alternative knight e2 was also possible, intending to activate the knight via the d4 square. So bishop h6, knight g6, bishop e3. Now black activates the bishop, first bishop h4, worsening the position of the queen, queen f3, and now bishop f6, and now knight d5. A standard move in the Sicilian, jumping to d5. It's a pawn sacrifice, but this is one of the ideas in the setup. Bishop d5, e d5, bishop takes b2, rook a b1, bishop e5, and queen h5. So you see, white sacrificed the pawn, but the pair of bishops and the active position of all pieces, rooks on the semi-open files, the queen on h5, targeting this pawn on h7, the knight, meaning that the knight on g6 cannot move. Ideas like rook f3, rook h3 give white plenty of compensation. And it's actually quite surprising that my Grandmaster opponent crumbled very quickly from this position, because in 3 more moves I was already winning. So he played rook f8, rook f3, threatening rook h3. So he goes knight f8, defending the knight, the pawn on h7. So defending against rook h3, or let's say g6 would be possible. But he missed that the rook on f3 has another target, another idea. The rook is also looking towards the queen side, and this is important, as now bishop b6 is a surprising move. And all of a sudden the queen on c7 is short of squares. Can't go to c3 because bishop h7 check would win the queen on c3. So he went queen d7, but now bishop f5, and the queen is really in crossfire. So where does it go to? If it goes to e7, it blocks the king's escape via e7, and now bishop h7 works. Knight h7, rook h3, and the knight cannot escape. And if something like g6, queen h7, king f8, rook f1, the attack is devastating. There is a threat of queen g6 because the pawn on f7 is pinned. So black played queen a4, but after rook b4 the queen is trapped. So you see another point of the rook on f3 being defending that pawn on a3. So white is winning, and yeah, I went on to win this game, my first ever against a Grandmaster. So now you can understand why I have these very warm feelings when it comes to the third rank setup. So we can go back now and let's take a look at the how this setup works against the Taimanov, because we started with the Taimanov. So we go back to the position after knight c3, and let's the move orders here. Another positive aspect for white here is that the move orders are not that important, because black can start with queen c7, black can start with a6, okay, bishop e3, again queen c7, knight b3 here, or knight f6, knight b3 again. And what will happen is that black will make the standard moves: b5, d6, queen c7, bishop b7, bishop e7, short castle. White will make his own standard moves: f4, bishop f3, queen f3, short castle, establishing the third rank setup. And then we will have the start of the middle game. And this is very practical from white's aspect, because white doesn't need to concentrate on the move order intricacies, but can in fact concentrate on the position which arises after all these standard moves have been played, and then explore the middle game plans. And as you can understand, just this gives white a massive advantage, because he can already concentrate on the middle game and discover ideas there. So let's make these moves. Let's say b5, bishop d3, d6, f4, bishop e7 or bishop b7. Doesn't really matter how black goes about this. Bishop e7, short castle. Again, it's possible to start with queen f3. There is quite a flexibility when it comes to the move orders. Let's say queen f3, bishop b7. And now one point I would like to make is that here white has the option of castling long. Yeah? And while possible, I would still be a bit uneasy to play it, because black still hasn't castled short. So, and he can immediately go after the bishop pair after knight b4. Let's say king b1, knight takes d3, c takes d3. This is the usual way white recaptures when the bishop is exchanged, because the pawn on d3 strengthens the pawn on e4 and dulls this pressure on the e4 pawn by the bishop on b7 and the knight on f6. But here after knight d7, black is quite flexible. The bishop pair may not be too active, but black is flexible and hasn't castled short, so it's not that straightforward for white to start the pawn storm, because there is no king on the king side just yet. While possible, I would still say that it's better to castle short in this particular version. So castling short instead of long. So let's say castles, queen c7, queen f3, and short castle. So we more or less need one more move by black, bishop b7 to complete the development, and one more move for white. And white here has a choice. I propose the most straightforward direct one, which is rook a e1, completing the development of all the pieces. Even though I will note one alternative, and it's one that I actively explored in the 90s, in the second half of the 90s, and it's connected with play on the queen side. Starts with the move a4, attacking the pawn on b5, and after b4, knight b1, with the idea of knight 1 d2, and then putting the knight on c4, targeting the b6 square, perhaps going a5, fixing that b6 weakness with play on the whole board. So some play on the queen side, at the same time keeping all these ideas on the king side with queen h3, e5, and so forth. So this is something interesting if you want to explore yourself. You can take a look at this. Okay, but now I just will show you the move rook a e1, bishop b7, and queen h3. And this is the standard, the basic position that you will most likely get when black chooses the Taimanov, or even the Scheveningen with the knight on c6 already. This can also rise from the classical Sicilian as well. So many different move orders can lead to this position, and you have to admit it that it's a huge advantage nowadays if you can just play 13 moves up to queen h3 at tempo and then know the ideas after that. Now this middle game position, the key in this middle game position is that white's main attacking piece is this bishop on d3. With the queen on h3, white already introduces ideas like e5, opening that bishop and targeting the h7 pawn by hitting that knight on f6. So what black should do in this position is to go after that bishop on d3 immediately with the move like knight b4. If black chooses not to do so, for example, I will show you that a move like b4, which is a standard move in the Sicilian, here it's suboptimal because it takes away the b4 square from the knight and the bishop on d3 stays alive. So a typical reaction to b4 is actually to put the knight on the rim, on a4. And have this idea in mind because it features quite often in the Sicilian in combination with the knight on b3. So the knight on a4 may look grim or dim on the edge of the board, but it targets the b6 square, and the knight on b3 conveniently controls the a4 square, so that knight on a4 cannot be attacked by queen a5. So the knights on b3 and a4 effectively stop black's counterplay on the queen side. So it's a standard idea for white in the Sicilian, so keep it in mind. Let's say a move like knight d7 covers the b6 square, and now the knight on b3 in fact can be rerouted to the king side with another typical maneuver, knight d2. Now if the knight on a4 is attacked, it can easily be defended by b3, the knight can come to f3, and white can continue piling up on the king side. Again, the most important thing I wanted to stress here is that the bishop on d3 is alive thanks to that pawn occupying the b4 square. So there is no knight attacking it. Another idea for black is a neutral move like rook f e8. And here different moves are possible. Let's say king h1, rook f3. But again, I would like to make it perhaps easier for you by connecting these ideas and the importance of that bishop on d3 by securing it and playing a move like a3. So we control the, too long an arrow. We control the b4 square, so there is no knight b4, and the key here is that after b4, we don't touch that pawn on b4, and we again play knight a4. The point being that now, again, black doesn't have access to the b4 square. If b takes a3, b takes a3, yes, white did disconnect his own structure on the queen side, but what was more important is to keep the bishop on d3 alive. So now the pawn on a3 is controlling the b4 square. And again, the maneuver knight d2, knight f3 can be possible at some stage, yeah, depending of how dangerous queen a5 is, obviously. So that is why black's best move here is the move knight b4, immediately going after the bishop on d3. So a3, forcing the exchange, knight takes d3, c takes d3, and this is another typical transformation in these positions where black won the bishop pair and eliminated this very important attacking bishop on d3, while white in return connected his center and blunted this typical Sicilian counterplay that black has against the e4 pawn, thanks to the pressure of the knight on f6 and the bishop on b7. Here, simply that is irrelevant because the pawn on d3 safely defends the pawn on e4. In addition to this, the strong pawn center allows white to launch an attack on the king side. Ideas here include the move knight d4, activating the knight on b3, and then proceeding with f5, g4, g5, or attack with pieces, rook f3, rook g3, rook f1, and so forth. So to give you some ideas, yeah, let's say rook fe8, knight d4, bishop f8, which is all nice and nice regrouping for black, but now simply rook f3. And now again, ideas like rook e f1, rook g3 can happen, g4, g5, yeah. Alternatively, yeah, f5 at some point. So white is simply going forward on the king side, where it's not quite clear where black's counterplay is, yeah, because thanks to that pawn on d3, there is no counterplay in the center against the e4 pawn, which is standard for black in the Sicilian. Another idea is rook ac8. This was played by Firouzja against Nakamura, quite a recent game, played last year to 2023 online. And now, apart from the standard move knight d4, which is perfectly fine, Nakamura decided to be even more aggressive. He went for f5, and after e5, g4. This is the timing of f5 is very important, because normally in this structure black wants to strike in the center with d5, which he did, but white is just in time to go g5, hit that knight on f6, and thus attack this pawn on d5. So now the only way for black not to lose a pawn is to go d4, but after g takes f6, bishop takes f6, now an improvement over Nakamura's place to go knight takes d4, e takes d4, bishop f4, getting away from the fork by attacking the queen, queen e7, knight e2, rook c2, knight g3, and this is quite dangerous for black. You can see all white's pieces are concentrated on the king side, and there are a lot of attacking ideas. Knight h5 being one, yeah, maybe rook f3, rook g3, or king h1, rook g1, using the g file, e5 at some point. Okay, obviously depending on what's happening on the long diagonal, and this heavy concentration of white pieces on the king side gives him really good chances of an attack. So this concept of concentrating all the pieces on the king side is one of the most important ones in these positions for white. So that means that here already black has really more or less one good move, yeah, and that is the move e5. And you understand by now why. Because if just playing vaguely allows white to launch this very strong attack with f5, g4, g5, and so forth. By playing e5, black strikes in the center and also controls the d4 square, so there is no knight d4. Now f5, d5 is already too slow. Yeah, the pawn is not in time to get to g5 to attack that knight on f6. Now rook c1 is an interesting alternative for white, but g4 is a more aggressive one. And here the threat is already f5, g5, and so forth. Black should take on f4, and after bishop f4 we reach this pretty sharp position. I will leave it at this, and I will just mention the two moves that you should check for yourself starting from this position, and these are the moves bishop c8 and queen c8, both of which target the pawn on g4, yeah, and both leads to pretty sharp and interesting position. You can explore this for yourselves. It's already move 17, so we are very deep into the middle game, and in order to get here you could see that black had to play in a really very exact and precise way. So again, I leave it to your exploratory desires to check the how the game can continue from here. And I can, some lines even lead deeply into an end game. So this is the Taimanov Sicilian. You could see that the practical aspect of this setup is that it gets you this more or less guaranteed position after move 13, which is after queen h3. And like I said, I gave you some ideas how the game can proceed. Feel free to explore even more if you like this. And by doing this type of work, you're pretty guaranteed that you'll be better prepared than your opponent. So now let's take a look at some other Sicilian. And that Sicilian is the classical. So knight c6, knight c3 or d4, doesn't really matter, yeah, d6, d4, cd4, knight d4, knight f6, so the classical Sicilian. And now we play the move knight b3. Yeah. So again, we are aiming for the third rank setup, bishop e3, bishop d3, f4, and so forth. So now black has a choice of two ways how to develop. So one is the Scheveningen setup with e6, and the other one is the dragon setup with g6. Now the good thing about the third rank setup, one more time, is that it works well for against the dragon as well. And via this move order, we will also explore the possibilities against the dragon, because they will transpose, as in the dragon, black develops the knight to c6 as well. Before exploring the dragon setups, let's check the Scheveningen with e6. So bishop e3, bishop e7, f4, short castle, queen f3. Standard development, yeah. Third rank setup. And keeping the option of long castle. And here this position is some sort of a, let's say, a trap for black. Because if black doesn't really know much about this, he hasn't analyzed or just doesn't feel the danger, and plays a lazy move like a6, yeah, which is, you would say, okay, how can a6 be wrong here, or how can a6 be wrong in the Sicilian? But in fact, here actually runs a6. I would even call it a dubious move, because it puts black under huge risks of getting under tremendous attack on the king side. And this is one of those situations, rare situations, where long castle works very nicely for white. Again, nothing wrong with bishop d3, short castle, and so forth, which we will most likely be a transposition to the Taimanov alliance we looked at after queen c7, b5, and so forth. Yeah. But this is a good opportunity to check how this attack with long castle and saving the tempo on the development of the light squared bishop, as white now will continue with g4, g5, can give white a tremendous attack. So let me show you some very exciting lines here. So queen c7, g4, b5, g5, knight d7, and rook g1. So this is already very, very dangerous for black. So again, b4, by now you should probably know the reaction, knight a4. It also works very well when white has castled queenside, because the knights really control all these important squares. Yeah, and together with the bishop, b5 is also controlled, so it's like some sort of a barrier on the queen side that black cannot easily breach, which means that there is it's difficult for black to create some activity on the queen side. So bishop b7, queen h3, and now okay, you should probably take a look at this at the alternatives yourself. But for example, when I looked at this, I was really surprised that the only move for black here is the move rook ac8, and everything else just like borderline loses. Yeah. So black will have to make quite a few of these only moves to stay somehow in the game, and even staying in the game is extremely dangerous. So f5 now. Rook g4 is something else that you can explore, but f5 is just more direct. the queen on h3, and the pawn on f5, attacking that pawn on e6. Only move for black now, b4. Okay. Again, when I say only, if you want to make, understand why it's an only move, switch your engine on, check for the alternatives and the refutations. Now g6, threatening mate on h7. So f takes g6, f takes g6, still threatening mate. And now only move for black, knight f6. Yeah. If h6, preventing the mate, but queen e6 check, king h8, knight d5, well, obviously it's devastating, yeah. So knight f6, and now a lot of tempting options for white. I'll just show you the most spectacular ones. Nothing wrong with queen e6 check, but I like bishop c4, sacrificing a piece and intending to take on e6 with the bishop. For example, if b takes c3, bishop e6 is possible, but there is even a stronger move, which means bishop h6, an amazing move. Yeah, targeting that pawn on g7 and keeping bishop e6 in reserve, and this is winning for white. So only move for black, knight e5. Now bishop e6 is possible, but another spectacular move, knight c5, just amazing. Now white could take on e6 with two pieces, but he wants to take with a third one, with the knight from c5. Another idea of the move is to close the c file, so there would be no threats against c2 or so forth, just killing off black's counterplay on the queen side. So d takes c5, now bishop e6 check, king h8, knight d5, bishop d5, e d5. Yeah. And we have this really messy position where white has sacrificed a piece for a pawn, but black is really tied down. h6 can never be played because bishop h6 is just curtains, and that means that the knight on f6 must always stay there to prevent mate on h7. This means that the knight on f6 is susceptible to various sacrifices like rook f1, rook f6. And this bishop on e6, knight on d5 are really like a thorn in black's throat. Obviously, white having all the threats and a safer king and an attack means that white has really a tremendous compensation for the piece. Objectively, the position is very unclear, but first to get here and then to play successfully from here is a very difficult practical task for black. With all this being said, again, there is an only move for black in this position, that is move rook cd8. Yeah. But I will leave that for you to explore. So now going back to the to move 9, where we made this natural Sicilian move a6. Now you understand why I say that this position is like a trap for black. One lazy move, which looks perfectly fine, perfectly normal, can lead black in grave danger. So the best move here for black is actually a5, not a6, in line with the modern Scheveningen ideas. Yeah, not playing a6, but playing a5, threatening some a4 to dislodge this knight from b3, perhaps even continuing with a3. Now white can play a4, this you can also explore, but I think bishop b5 is a bit more ambitious, trying to immediately take advantage of the weakened b5 square. Now knight b4, attacking the pawn on c2, and queen e2, defending the pawn on c2. And now black should play e5. So this type of play, in the style of the modern Scheveningen, gives black sufficient counterplay in this position. Still, it's pretty unclear. Let's a3. If we continue the line, drawing the knight back, bishop g4 first, developing with tempo, queen d2, e takes f4, now bishop takes f4, knight c6, and now short castle. Yes. Pretty standard Sicilian position, objectively equal. Black is fine here, but so is white, and what white will try to do is to try to play in the center, perhaps on the queen side, trying to take advantage of these weakened b5, b6 square on the queen side, and also perhaps trying to put some pressure on that d6 pawn. Even in some endgame, for example, if black manages somehow to push d5, The exchange on d5 can lead to an endgame where white will still try to make something out of these weakened squares on the queen side and try to do something with this majority on the queen side. So still, it has to be said that the position is equal, and this is black's best way to play with this Scheveningen setup in the classical Sicilian. So we go back. I would still say that black really needs to know that this is the best way to react to the third rank setup against the classical. Now let's take a look at the dragon. So g6. I will point out the move order against the dragon via the let's say the more standard move order, but it won't matter because we will have a transposition. So g6, bishop e3, bishop g7, and now a small subtlety on white's part, not the immediate f3, which Carlsen himself playing black pointed out why not, because bishop e6, queen d2, now d5 is possible. And Carlsen played against Anton Guijaro at the Waikanzei tournament in 2021. He equalized, and the long game ended in a draw. Carlsen himself played queen d2 first, and the idea is that now bishop e6, now not f3, d5, but there are two options. One is bishop e2. Yeah, we will see that this is where the bishop is developed in these lines, and the other one is long castle. So two different extra options which prevent d5. So normally black castles, and now f3, bishop e6, long castle, we get this standard position in the dragon. I will show you two games played by Magnus Carlsen with white. He won both pretty convincingly. The good aspect here for white is that the dragon with the knight on b3 makes it more difficult for black to create counterplay on the queen side. So for example, queen a5 obviously is not possible. And the knight on b3 does not block the d file. Yeah? And this allows for some knight d5 ideas, some e5 tactical ideas. They may happen or may not. And the third aspect is of the knight being on b3 is that it frees the d4 square for the bishop. And we will see putting a bishop on d4 is an important positional idea for white in these structures. Obviously, the pawn storm, g4, h4, h5, g4, and so forth is still very much on the menu. So, knight e5, standard maneuver for black in the dragon, getting to c4, king b1, rook c2, and both Carlsen's games reached this position, he played different moves here against Shevchenko. In 2023, he played h4, h5, h4 threatening h5, so h5 is the standard reaction, stopping it, and now bishop e2, finishing development and preparing at some point the breakthrough with g4. And it's curious that very quickly white was winning here. After a6 by black, bishop d4, I mentioned this, very important idea for white in these positions to neutralize that dragon bishop on g7. Queen c7 and now g4. So it can't get simpler than this, okay? It's white just finished development and started an attack. Black, where is black's counterplay? Yeah. So h takes g4, f4 now, the standard again idea, hitting that knight on e5, knight c6, and now bishop takes f6, destroying the defender of the king side and to allow for h5, opening the h file, or f5. So knight, bishop f6, knight d5, and white is already winning. Okay, the queen is attacked, the pawn is, the bishop is attacked, f5, h5 are coming, the h file will be opened, queen can come to h6, and it's basically game over. White won in 7 more moves from this position. In the other game, played at the World Cup in 2021 against Martinovic, Carlsen played bishop e2, and now Martinovic started bishop e2. Now Martinovic played the somewhat dubious move bishop c4, And now there was nothing wrong with Carlsen's standard bishop d4, bishop e2, queen e2, yeah, and then again starting perhaps a pawn storm because black has no counterplay. But then it was even stronger to go f4 now, and after bishop takes e2, queen takes e2, knight c4, bishop d4, there is already the very annoying threat of e5. So you see again, thanks to the semi-open d file, and black is already under pressure here. So you see, it's very straightforward to play against the dragon, and now I will show you that this is perfectly we are getting a transposition if black plays the standard move order against trying to get to the dragon with d6. So d4, cd4, knight d4, knight f6, knight c3, g6, yeah, bishop e3, bishop g7, f3, short castle, queen d2. We are giving the impression that we are playing a normal dragon. The moment the knight comes to c6, we drop back the knight to b3, and there we go. We have a transposition, bishop e6, long castle, and we have reached exactly the same position as via the classical move order that we just looked at. So we covered the Taimanov, we covered the classical, we covered the what else did we cover? Taimanov, classical, the dragon, yeah. So what remains is the big one, the Najdorf. So a6, yeah, and third rank setup, start time, knight b3. So it's very straightforward. It's really even hard to mess up the move order for white here. Even though it has to be said that against the Najdorf, there are some deviations to the standard development, but okay. I mean, you are really getting a universal, very universal weapon against all these major Sicilians. So it's, and it, even though some nuances and details need to be learned and memorized, it's still nothing compared to all the mainstream theory that you are getting if you play some of the main lines against all these four major Sicilians. So knight b3. Najdorf being a flexible opening, black has quite a few different setups at his disposal, but the main ones again are the dragon setups with g6 and the Scheveningen setups with e6. Now a move like b5 is actually not very good because white can immediately start attacking the queen side with a4. So, and after b4, knight d5, already black has some issues to solve. The problem is that that pawn on e4 cannot really be taken because queen f3 exposes black on the long diagonal. And something like f5, bishop d3 is already pretty devastating. Yeah, short castle, white is so far ahead in development and black has so many weaknesses, so it's not very likely that he will survive. So after knight d5, e6 is better, and now knight takes f6, queen takes f6, bishop d3. We are getting something akin to the third rank setup, but the difference is this exposed nature of black's queen side, and it's very important to know how to take advantage of this. So black should start with knight c6 because bishop b7, knight a5 immediately targets that bishop and takes advantage of the fact that the queen no longer is on d8 controlling that square on a5. So knight c6 therefore, short castle, bishop b7 and f4. So a standard move, even though introducing some e5, f5 ideas obviously, but white's actually idea here would be to play on the queen side, and the setup worth remembering is to go a5, to fix the b6 square, fix the pawn on a6, yeah, and isolate this pawn on b4, and at the same time, okay, after a5, to go maybe bishop d2, queen e2, looking towards the queen side, and some e5 ideas still bearing in mind. So the setup is bishop d2 and queen e2. Normally white should take some precaution what happens if black takes on b2, but normally this shouldn't work, but white should make sure it won't work. So the setup here is not quite third rank, bishop e3, queen f3, but rather bishop d2, queen e2, yeah, looking towards the queen side and still keeping ideas like e5 to blast open the center. So this is the line with b5, not a very good one. Now another not very good line for black is the move e5. Now this may look like the standard Najdorf move, but it's bad because it basically grants white a full tempo. If you know the Najdorf, you would know that e5 is usually played after white plays bishop e2 or bishop e3. But here there is neither a bishop on e3 nor a bishop on e2. And this means that white can save a tempo on those moves. So white, for example, will not play bishop e3 here transposing to the English attack, but rather bishop g5, immediately targeting the weakened d5 square by attacking the knight that defends it. And now let's say bishop e7, take on f6, bishop takes f6, queen d3. This is a plan from the bishop e2 e5 Najdorf, but one where white is a full tempo up because the bishop doesn't really need to be on e2. And we will see in the subsequent play that white saves one very important tempo by not moving the bishop and in fact speeding up his other play, which is to castle long, target that pawn on d6 and then attack on the king side with g3 and f4. So the bishop, it's the same plan that white employs in the bishop e2 e5 line when he plays bishop g5, only without bishop e2. So obviously a full tempo would give white an advantage. So now the idea is to go long castle or rook d1 to target the pawn on d6. So let's say bishop e6, long castle, attacking the pawn, bishop e7 and g3. The idea is to push f4. Yeah, so if ef4, gf4 is possible. Yeah, let's say knight d7 and f4. And this is quite comfortable for white because, like I said, it's a full tempo up. And white will continue with f4. If bishop c4, let's say an illustrative line, okay? Let's say knight f6, yeah. King b1, normal consolidatory move, b5, a3, stopping b4, let's say rook c8, f5 now, hitting the bishop, bishop c4, queen f3, and then the pawn storm is coming, g4, h4, g5, and so forth. You see, the bishop never really needs to leave f1, and if it's exchanged, then black would have spent a lot of tempo to exchange the bishop that never moved. So this is already quite promising for white. That's why the standard move e5 is not very good against knight b3. But the other moves are obviously quite possible. g6 is an attempt at the dragon, but we already saw how we go about it. Bishop e3, bishop g7, queen d2. Yeah. And now, whichever way, more or less, black plays, f3 and long castle. And it's very likely that we get a transposition because the knight comes to c6, bishop comes to e6, a6 is played by black at some point, as we saw in the Carlsen games, and again, nothing very different from what we looked at previously. An interesting idea here for black is knight c6. So this is something akin to the classical, yeah, with a6 already played. And after bishop e3, now to go knight g4. Yeah. For example, if e6, going for some, let's say, Scheveningen setups, nothing wrong with f4. We already know this, queen f3 and so forth, or a6 already being played. We may get a transposition with those very dangerous lines with long castle. Yeah. But this also gives an additional option to white, which is g4 immediately. Let's say, yeah, and let's say b5, g5, knight d7, queen d2, and we're getting long castle, f4, h4, and so forth. Standard Sicilian position with attacking chances for white, and circumventing all these heavy theory. So after knight c6, bishop e3, knight g4 is an attempt to keep the game in some original way. Bishop drops back to d2, and now knight f6. Yeah. So perhaps black wants to, I don't know, repeat and make a draw or whatever. But white can avoid this. One idea is to go queen e2. Another one is to go f3. Yeah, stopping knight g4, and now e6 or g6, let's say e6, queen e2, bishop e7, castles, b5, g4. We have something akin to the English attack, yeah, with the bishop being on d2 and the queen on e2 instead of bishop e3 and queen d2. Yeah. But again, No theory, typical open Sicilian fight with chances for an attack. Yeah, J5, H4, some G6 ideas, sacrifices after H5, Rook G1, yeah, and so forth. Again, definitely worth exploring further. So what remains is to check the Scheveningen version, which is E6. But now the knight being on B3, we can immediately start with G4. Yeah. Black should play B5, because if H6 is a bit too slow, as Queen E2 now allows for quick castling on the queen side. So B5, let's say, A3. We will see that in these lines, it's important to stop Black's B4. Yeah. So A3, Bishop B7, H4, and again very sharp. Rook can come to G1, support G5. The bishop will be developed to D2. Yeah, long castle to D2 because White needs to keep control over the E4 pawn. So B5 is the main move. And now, like I said, it's important to play A3, and I think A3 is a bit better than the immediate G5. G5 would have been ideal if White could play it, but what I don't like here so much, even though it's perfectly playable and possible if you like these types of positions, is that Black can here play the move B4. Because knight FD7, A3, it's already pretty good. White managed to get the pawn to G5 to kick away the knight from F6 and then simply develop, let's say, Bishop E7, Bishop E3, Knight C6, Queen D2 and long castle. It's already quite promising for White. Yeah. B4 is stopped and the knight has been kicked away from F6. But the problem is B4. Now GF6, BC3 is fine for Black. So Knight D5 is the critical move. And this again poses some, I mean, if Black doesn't know or is caught, I mean, unprepared, it can be very dangerous. Because the only move here for Black is to take on E4, Knight E4. ED5, GF6 is just awful. Just destroyed Black's central structure, E6, D6. Knight FD7 is also not that great because after knight B4 there isn't really a compensation for the pawn. Taking with the knight on D5 is also not great because ED5, E5, A3, Bishop E7, H4. Black is on the defensive on both wings. Yeah. So B8, Rook A3, and there is also pressure on A6. There are ideas like Knight A5, Knight C6. And the bishop will be developed to E3. Also looking down the queen side, and once a knight is on A5, C4, B4 can advance, and White's king is quite safe in the center because Black can't really reach it. So this is Black is somewhat solid but lacking active counterplay. But the problem, like I pointed out, is the move knight E4. Still, it's possible to play like this. Yeah, Bishop E3. Yeah. ED5, Queen D5 is just awful, obviously, attacking the rook and attacking the knight. So Knight C5. Now knight takes B4. Bishop B7, attacking the rook. Okay, Rook G1, Knight D7, Knight D3, Knight D3, Bishop D3, and it's basically a mess. Yeah. If you like the mess, feel free to enter here, analyze it a bit more deeply. It's just my personal preference that I prefer the move A3 as it's more like, let's say, Sicilian. It looks more Sicilian to me. Here it's like a bit of more like a fist fight as it lacks these Sicilian characteristics. The position, I mean. So A3 stopping B4. Bishop B7 now for Black, attacking the pawn on E4. And now Bishop G2. Queen E2 would have been nice, yeah, in line with some of the ideas we saw before, but Black has D5. And this works nicely for him. So I don't really... I mean, it's still possible. You can check this, especially after Bishop G5 and so forth. But I think it's okay for Black. So Bishop G2, therefore. Knight FD7, avoiding some G5 in advance, and now Bishop E3. And now again we get standard Sicilian. Black is fine, but so is white, and it's basically anybody's game in a sharp, double-edged Sicilian position. So let's say knight e5, queen e2, knight c4, attacking the bishop and the pawn, long castle, knight d7 and h4. So h4 is important because some rook h3 ideas at some point may be interesting. So what white does is that, okay, he is willing to part with this very important bishop on e3, but in return he obtained very smooth development, managed to castle long, obtained advantage in development, and is ready to advance on the king side. So sharp play ahead. Please take a deeper look at this, because it's definitely worth it. Explore some ideas. I can show you one here, for example. Let's say rook c8 f4, and now the pawn sacrifice, knight takes a3, thanks to the fact that the rook is attacking the knight on c3. But the idea is that after bishop d4, defending the knight, knight c4 and g5, white sacrificed the pawn, but the bishop is very strong, doesn't allow for the development of the bishop on f8, and that pawn on a3 doesn't really matter much as of now. So very sharp, very double-edged, and definitely worth digging into in greater detail if you are willing to play these positions. So with this, I will conclude the simplified Open Sicilians video. I hope this was, well, interesting, at least. I would say definitely practical solution if you want to play Open Sicilians with white, but you want to avoid all these massively and deeply analyzed theoretical lines. I think this third rank setup is a pretty good solution, at least for starters, to get a feeling for the Open Sicilians, and then obviously you can build up on this knowledge with exploring other variations by all means. So now comes the time when I'm doing my Hikaru stuff, so make sure you smash that subscribe button and well, subscribe, support, comment, play the Open Sicilian, and hope you enjoyed this video. Well, what remains now for me is to thank you for watching and say that I'll see you again pretty soon. Good luck.